This is Appendix A, and you may be wondering why Appendix A is coming last, because A implies that it's really the first thing that we did. But in fact, it used to be Appendix K, and then what was Appendix A was a list thanking all the people that had helped us with the project in one way or another, and we put those into the acknowledgments, and so we turned K into A. And the reason it's K is because it really is an attempt to kind of take the analysis that was done in various of the appendices that you've heard about over the last couple of days and push it in terms of thinking about what it means for how we go about doing this. And so Jay just addressed for you sort of if we made a decision about a peripheral canal, what are all the details we'd have to get into in order to do it right. This one is kind of starting with the perspective, well, our analysis suggests that that we do have some good long-term alternatives, ways of being proactive in working with the changing delta that are going to be better for the environment and better for the economy than just kind of continuing business as usual. And that points in the direction of a peripheral canal or possibly a dual conveyance implemented in certain ways also. And so sort of starting from there, I said, okay, well, what would it take to be able to do that from a policy and regulatory perspective? So we're looking at really a set of things that are kind of taking this long-term perspective on how the delta is changing and thinking about this change in policy as a sort of a way of tackling that and thinking, okay, well, could we, if we have all of Jay's questions answered on implementation, could we go ahead and do this, and or what would we have to change in our system as we currently operate in order to go ahead and do this? So it's not governance writ large. It's really kind of some focused things, and the first few of them are really about regulatory issues and how we address those. So one is regulating water quality, because any kind of change that we're going to make in the delta, peripheral canal or dual conveyance is going to require a new water quality control plan, and so brings up Clean Water Act issues. So we wanted to get a sense of what the implications were for that. Then a second one is anticipating levee failures. As you heard yesterday, there are a number of, the risks are tremendous, a lot of levees that are probably not worth repairing, and probably also some sense in thinking about pre-flooding. What does that mean in terms of the liabilities of folks that own those islands or, for the state? Then upstream diverters. This is something that we talked about already in the first report, and that the Delta Vision has put a lot of focus on, sort of thinking about how would you incorporate them in a solution if we're thinking about addressing the question of how much water do the fish need in the Delta, and who should contribute to that. Protecting endangered species. This goes to the heart of the current process of the BDCP, the Bay Delta Conservation Plan, and thinking about ways of trying to address endangered species issues in a sort of more comprehensive way than just sort of permits for take of individual species at the pumps. And then some questions that get into an area that Jay glossed over by throwing it onto me of if you're going to build a peripheral canal, key governance questions about how you would manage it, and these are central to how big you could make a canal and have people feel comfortable about it. And then a little bit on conclusions. So this goes straight into first the issue of regulating water quality. So, our analysis points to the idea that for the fish, what we've been doing in terms of managing water quality in the Delta has been really a bad thing, in the sense that we've been basically trying to keep things as stable as possible in terms of salinity and other conditions in order to allow us to use that water, both draw it into the export pumps and then also to keep it usable for in-delta diverters. What Peter and Bill's analysis highlights is that much more variability would be better, kind of trying to go back and mimic some of the natural flow regimes that allow more variability across years and within years than is currently the case. the hydrodynamic modeling that Bill Fleener showed you yesterday shows that really over the long term, delta farming using water, taking water directly from the delta is going to be compromised both by sea level rise as salinity increases, and then also by the possibility of catastrophic island failures. And this graph that, use the mouse, right? This graph just synthesizes some of the spider charts that Bill showed you yesterday, just in terms of kind of from a regulatory perspective, thinking about this in terms of days exceeding irrigation standards within the irrigation season at 3 different points in the delta, at current sea level rise and at current sea level, and then with 1 and 3 feet of sea level rise. So San Joaquin River at Jersey Point, which was one of the sites we looked at, going from not too many days out of exceeding standards to about 25% of days exceeding standards with 1 foot, and about 50% by 3 feet of sea level rise. Sacramento River at Edmonton, already not so great in terms of the salinities there. Although this doesn't necessarily mean that there are regulatory violations because it's averages over periods. Gets worse with 1 foot and worse again with 3. South Delta at Clifton Court 4 Bay, going from 0 basically now to conditions by 3 feet that are going to make agriculture pretty much hard to consider probably. So these are sort of the long-term trends that we're facing. This is without island failures. With island failures, you could go to the 3 feet point or more pretty quickly. So thinking about that, Delta Ag is compromised over the long term anyway, and there are basically some fundamental conflicts between maintaining stability of the water quality for Delta Ag and allowing the variability for the fish. And it's a situation where that would be a conflict if you continue through delta pumping. That would be a conflict for all users of delta water, including all of those who use water from the pumps. But if you build a peripheral canal, you basically can solve the problem for anybody who can tie into the canal. So now comes the legal and regulatory question. These are all designated beneficial uses under the Clean Water Act, and although the Clean Water Act doesn't guarantee any particular level of salinity, that is built into the Water Quality Control Plan now, there's a possibility for changing that to some extent, but there's basically no provision in that law for de-designating designated beneficial uses. So it means that if we want to be proactive about it, we really have to think about how we might be able to make some adjustments in ways that allow us to get better environmental conditions for the fish while maintaining agricultural uses, but probably in some changed ways, maybe being able to push that at the margin in terms of seasons and years and so on. It's something we have to talk with the feds about. It's not something that's going to be on their radar unless we have it on our radar. And this is an issue even for something like an experimentation. We've talked about recommended experimental flooding of an island or two to be able to see what kind of conditions that creates for fish and so on. Even some kind of tweaking like that without a major revision in the system with a peripheral canal would probably require addressing this issue from a regulatory perspective. So second is delta levees and liability. Here I'm showing you the map that Robin and Jeff presented yesterday of where all of the blue islands that are highlighted are the ones that don't pass the cost-benefit test in terms of having enough economic value on the islands to warrant levee repairs if there's a failure. And they also tend to be levees with very high failure probability, which is partly why this calculation comes out this way. The economic analysis basically gives you these numbers. The hydrodynamic analysis that Bill showed you yesterday also shows that when we look at island failures, not all of them are necessary from a water quality perspective. Looks like probably only, if carefully managed, only the western islands are really central for maintaining water quality, water salinity at levels that would allow export pumping. If you manage those failures in a judicious way, and that suggests probably also that pre-flooding might make sense in order to limit the risk of catastrophic failure that would create big water quality problems. Now, this raises a legal and regulatory question in terms of liability. And the issue is, if your island fails, it's not just your island that is at stake. There are some impacts on neighboring islands. This was something that was actually incorporated into the analysis that Jeff and Robin did in terms of one of the costs of not repairing an island is that you have some implications for needing to bulk up basically the levees in neighboring islands, and that can be pretty consequential. I think, on the order of probably about $10 million per island, something like that. So the question is, if we're going to have a policy where we don't automatically go in like we have been and just repair everything as soon as it fails, we need to kind of know what we're looking at in terms of liability and who's going to cover those costs. And it turns out that the issues are interesting, and they're quite different for project and non-project levees. So this map shows you, I'm afraid you can't really tell very well, what's marked in red are the non-project levees, basically owned and managed by the reclamation districts, and then the yellow, which is kind of up on the fringes along the Sac River and along the San Joaquin River, those are project levees. So under the federal flood control project with state managing that. So for the non-project levees, most of which is private landowners, if it is a private landowner, basically, and that island fails, good luck getting any kind of compensation for neighboring landowners, because they will essentially have to bill themselves in order to pay, and there's the way we have rules set up on fundraising at the local level. It's pretty much up to them to do that, and it's pretty unlikely. If it turns out that it's the state that has already, state already owns Sherman Island, or I guess the whole thing, right? Owns some land there, but also the state might get into the practice of buying up some islands as part of a mitigation for transitions in the delta. Well, the state has deep enough pockets that you can be sure that they'll get sued, and probably pretty effectively if they're found to be at fault in negligent in terms of letting their levee go. If they're pre-flooding intentionally, you can be sure that they're liable, and so that means we really have to kind of know ahead of time. All right, what kind of policy do we have in place for this? Now, for project levees, and that includes, I think, yes, Sherman Island, about half is project and half is non-project. So that's an interesting one, since that's a nice deep one that has a really high probability of failure. If a levee goes, a project levee goes, basically we have to fix it right now under current law. And we have to get the Army Corps of Engineers to agree if we didn't want to fix it, and that probably would require congressional authorization. So it's not something that can kind of just be decided, levee fails, do we go in or not? We really have to kind of have this mapped out ahead of time. So now moving on to the issue of upstream diverters. And this is something that we talked about some in the first report, and we were, I think, surprised by the numbers. These are numbers that Jay had pulled together, table 6.1 in the first report, which I just put into graphical terms. So the average for the 95 to 2005 period shows you net outflows, let me see, net delta outflows, upstream diversions, and delta diversions, or what's used in the delta or by exporters. And a striking thing, and this has been talked about a lot since then, is that the upstream diversions are actually a lot bigger than the export diversions, about twice as much. So raising questions about what the role should be of upstream diverters. Now, the biological and ecological analysis that Peter and Bill have done, as long as we have the current through delta system, the pumps themselves are a big part of the problem, both through entrainment and through confusion of the fish and messing up the habitat by pulling water in unnatural ways through the delta. But in a peripheral canal world, we can basically get rid of that part of the problem. And then really all we're looking at is how much water do the fish need. Now, we didn't answer that question in this in this report, but clearly there's an issue of if you're going to do any kind of environmental management, the delta has to address the question of what kind of flow requirements under different conditions. And certainly our analysis suggests that it's going to be variable, and you want it to be variable You want it to be a lot more variable than it has been. But in any case, there's likely to be a need for some water for the fish. And if you've disentangled this problem from the pumps, then you want to look at the system holistically and consider upstream diversions as well as export diversions. Now, the economics that Jay presented to you yesterday from Appendix F shows that restricting exports as a way of dealing with delta outflows is a lot more expensive than directly regulating delta outflows, because you allow much more flexibility in the system as to where the water comes from, and you can use lower cost water for those outflows, and some of that happens to be up in the Sac Valley or other upstream areas. So this is not a completely new question, and this was actually looked at in the 1995 environmental impact report for the water quality control plan, sort of thinking, okay, what could happen? And there is definitely a legal basis for doing a number of different things. So right now, what we're working with is a system where it is the export projects that are responsible for delta outflows, the CVP and the State Water Project. But the other alternatives are using a priority basis, water rights priority basis, and there are a couple of different ways that was examined in the water quality control plan EIR. That because upstream diverters tend to be more senior in priority anyway, that doesn't change the picture a whole lot, although it could be important for some users. What they also looked at, which is an interesting alternative, is proportional basis for cutbacks on a watershed basis. And there, the idea is priority is not in and of itself a reason why you shouldn't have to contribute to the environmental solutions. And that's been established in law anyway. So establish a proportional rule in a watershed basis, and everybody contributes. And you could imagine a proportional rule like that working in combination with a water market, so that an upstream diverter who's an urban upstream diverter might want to pay some of the ag diverters upstream in order to not actually have their share cut back. But it's just a basic way of kind of allocating responsibility. Then the third way is markets, which is kind of how it's done now to some extent, with the exporters being responsible. Now, a question that comes up, whether we use any three of these alternatives, if we're trying to increase upstream diverters' contribution to flows, is that if we're just talking about it in terms of surface water, there is the groundwater surface water connection, that nasty little problem, which is especially important in the Sac Valley. And from a regulatory perspective, it's really hard to get at that. And in fact, the State Water Resources Control Board just had this issue in the Russian River area, where they were requiring some cutbacks in surface water use by by Sonoma County Water Agency mainly, but I guess also more generally on the system. And what they found was that there was a tremendous increase in groundwater pumping, with exactly very similar effects in terms of the impacts on flows in the Russian River. So that's something we would have to work out, no matter which way we try to get upstream diverters to contribute. So now, moving on to the key issue for the BDCP. So habitat conservation plans are a way of addressing endangered species issues in a more multi-species way, where the idea is that you're looking at a plan for, in an overall sense, managing the habitat for species recovery, and not just one species, typically multiple species. And this is a way of getting around, in a sense, the species by species take permits that the projects currently have. It's an ambitious process in the sense that it's something that has been working okay in much easier contexts of land development, various places. For terrestrial species, where you've got a lot fewer variables to have to try to control. This is complex. From what we looked at, there was one other aquatic multi-species conservation plan on the lower Colorado, and I don't know if that's going through EIR yet, Joe. I don't know, you may know.
Yes, it has.
Okay. Anyway, it's ambitious, but when we started looking at these issues from a long-term perspective, we realized that it's actually more ambitious than we thought, certainly, and then I'm guessing that people are probably grappling with now as they're dealing with this in the context of BDCP. So, our analysis suggests that fish prospects are best with no exports, and that's true for of the 4 fish that we surveyed the group of experts on. It's true for the 2 that we did more detailed analysis on, both for the Delta smelt and for the salmon. But it suggests also that, let's see, where's my little guy here? Oh well, all right. I'm just going to talk you through with the colors. It also suggests, though, that under the best of circumstances, even with no exports, we're not looking at a picture of really high probabilities of survival. So this is the graph for the Delta smelt, where it's really the question we asked was, by mid-century, are they going to be around or not? And that's basically the condition for Endangered Species Act enforcement. And we find that there's a good chance that they won't, no matter what we do. Now, if you think about this from a legal and regulatory perspective, it's complex in the sense that the Habitat Conservation Plan as an alternative is fundamentally not an alternative, in that if you lose a critter, the regular species by species provisions kick in. And so there's a real risk that if we lose this guy, even if the conservation plan is really great and in earnest trying to anticipate all this stuff and think about changing conditions in the Delta and so on, there's a real risk that that could lead to the pumps being shut down anyway, just given the way the law is written now. And to some extent that's because it's very hard to disentangle the role of exports from other factors. So it's always going to be possible to say, well, it's possible that we could do better if we got rid of exports. So I guess want to highlight this as a dilemma. This is something that folks in the Fish and Wildlife Service, the sort of professional fish guys, are very aware of, and but it's something that is going to, the Delta may be the poster child for it. It's not going to be the last case for sure. We're going to be facing these issues in terms of in-stream flow, temperatures on a lot of our rivers throughout the West, and many other things as the climate changes. And as long as there's a possibility that human intervention is helping to muck things up in some way, the law is kind of not speaking to that in a way that allows one to disentangle it easily. So we probably need to be talking with our federal regulator colleagues as well as our state regulator colleagues on this to figure out some proactive solutions. Because the sad thing about it is that this is probably the way that the best way to get ecosystem investments going in this system, by having exporters providing funds. And if it's so difficult to get success on all the measures that are required by ESA, we can be jeopardizing the good of the system as a whole and those benefits. So now moving on to the peripheral canal and sort of things that are right at the top of the list in terms of what has to be done now. If we make a strategic decision on a peripheral canal, before we can get very far in doing anything on it, we have to figure out, I think probably can't even make that decision until people are comfortable with the kind of safeguards that we can provide for it. I'll say it that way. And what this map shows you is the voting patterns in California in June of 1982 on Proposition 9, which was the peripheral canal. The very dark red, which is completely covering Northern California, except for, is that Tehama up there? Shasta County. I don't know. They were only in the 70 to 90% no range. Everybody else was in more than 90% no range. The green shows you folks who voted, counties that voted majority yes, and it wasn't even that strong in some of those counties. So it kind of highlights sort of some of the reasons why this is a contentious issue that's coming back up, and people remember this. Even if they were kids, their parents remember it. So so was our sense that, it's really important to look at what are some of the key concerns that led to this vote, and are there ways in which the peripheral canal would still raise these concerns, and are there ways to address those? And the two key ones that we identify are, one, environmental. Even though at the time there were folks that were pointing out that the canal could provide environmental benefits, ultimately there was a large environmental movement sort of against the canal because of concerns that it wouldn't be managed in such a way that would be beneficial to the fish. And there was also tremendous concern in Northern California, and it looks like Northern California started in, I don't know, San Luis or something, that somehow that this was a water grab by Southern California. They're going to steal our water. And so, looking at it today, some of the conditions have changed in the sense that the Bay Area is now much more dependent on Delta exports than it was back then, and in fact somewhat more dependent than Southern California. So it's possible that the positions might shift in parts of the Bay Area, at least, just if they understood sort of where water came from. It's always clear, because when our report came out back in July in the San Francisco Chronicle, there was an article and then a lot of online commentary, and everybody from San Francisco was talking about how they're taking our water, not recognizing that San Francisco is actually a diverter too, and it's not. Yeah. Anyway, I live in San Francisco, so right. I can say that I'm a ratepayer of the SFPUC. So those conditions have changed, and certainly the canal that we're talking about now is a very different canal from back then. That was really about expanding water supply. Yes, there were some potential environmental benefits, but there was not nearly the kind of analysis about an understanding of the Delta ecosystem problems. And Peter, in conversations, you've said that probably at the time, even if with good intentions, that would have ended up being a disaster just because of the limited knowledge at the time about some of those issues. But if we say, okay, well, starting from the perspective that we're looking at a canal now that would provide environmental benefits, that's one of the key objectives of it, as well as water supply reliability. What kind of canal should we build, and what kind of governance system could be appropriate? And the hydrodynamic analysis suggests that a larger canal is probably better in terms of environmental management, just because I think Bill probably talked about this some, and Jay mentioned it. It allows you to be more flexible in when you draw water through the system, and maybe operate it on the tidal cycle or so on. The geophysics of the problem suggests that a dual conveyance option is at best temporary, in the sense that eventually the through delta component is not going to be viable because of sea level rise and or island failure. And the economics of the problem suggest that once you start cutting exports back way a lot, then it starts to become really expensive, and also that there are economies of scale in construction. So these are all factors that kind of point to the question of how big should the canal be, and should the way of having safeguards for Sacramento Valley folks who don't want a water grab, or safeguards for the fish, do you do it through a really small pipe, or do you do it through governance? There have been a number of folks who've been much more comfortable with the idea of the small pipe, 1 million acre feet, 1.5 million acre feet. So we're suggesting that actually governance safeguards are preferable to the small canal. And the idea is that, from the perspective from a long-term perspective, if you do dual with a small pipeline, that's all you're going to end up with is the water in the pipeline, which is going to be costly. And then, in terms of environmental management, there could be advantages to having flexibility to vary flows. So this is a sort of simple little schematic. Imagine this is the pipe, or the canal, the 100% conveyance capacity. Here we go. 100% of the conveyance capacity is here. What we're suggesting is you build a system where you have some minimum delta flows, and those would vary by season and by year. And then you build a canal large enough to accommodate flexibility, both in terms of allowing you to draw in wet years more, and also to have the flexibility in terms of environmental management at the intake. And you allocate some capacity I've lost my mouse again. You allocate some capacity for the fish, so that's the part in yellow or the gold there. And the numbers are all, the numbers don't mean anything. This is purely illustrative, so don't sort of look and say, oh, why 40%? And, that's more just to give the idea. And then the export allocation, there would be some minimum, which would be, probably different in dry years and in wet years. So the dark green would be that minimum amount, and then the sort of light green would be the variable amount for exporters depending on the quality of the water year. Now, this idea of shared capacity for the fish, this is something that actually we didn't know this at the time we were writing it. It's already in practice on the Truckee River system with storage, that they have a share of the storage in that system. So it's not a completely heretical or untried idea, although it would be a little bit different with conveyance. You also, for this safeguards for Sac Valley folks, you set a long-term average for exports. You want to have flexibility from year to year just because we have wet years and dry years. And so that dotted line up at the top there gives you the, here we go again, gives you the, idea of having this maximum 20-year average. And that's a way of making sure that you're not over the long term draining the Sac Valley of their supplies. Now, with the environmental allocation, with the fish allocation, that could also allow you in times when the fish managers decide, okay, we really want more water in the delta, they just leave that part of the canal empty. And when they feel like it's a good time to not have as much water in the delta, they can lease that to exporters. So financing principles, just want to run through this quickly because Jay talked about it some. Users should pay for the canal. There's no question. And mostly they've said that they're willing to do that. We're also suggesting that all diverters, both exporters and upstream diverters, should contribute to both flows and probably also funds for the ecosystem. And we highlight the use of water quality windfalls as one of those sources. So this is just to show you again one of the graphs that Richard showed you earlier today of the savings for agricultural users on the order of a few $100 million a year. Large savings also for urban users. And then there are questions about the role of public funds. Traditionally in California, we've thought of the ecosystem as one of the natural beneficiaries of public funds in the water system, and there's probably a role for that, although I think that's going to be a question. Certainly there's also an important role for water users, and there are sound economic principles for having mitigation like that. And then there's another question in terms of delta landowners. As to, we've talked about mitigation for delta landowners. Whether or not there's a legal obligation to do that, it makes good sense to do that, to ease the transition in the delta. Is that something where public funds should play a role, or is that also something where exporters, as part of a canal solution, should fund that? It would be important to get better numbers on that and what that would look like in order to move forward on that. But if you thought about a world where the sort of today's world with the tremendous budget problems that we have, if the exporters were willing to consider a comprehensive solution for the delta, you wouldn't need to go to the voters for a bond at all. You could do a revenue bond and fund all of this, and ratepayers would pay for it. So just to kind of wind up, policy needs for a delta solution, these are sort of thinking about if we're gonna move in those directions, some of the things that we need to do now and start now in terms of thinking about it and addressing. One is the impending regulatory issues. Both we're going to need a new Delta water quality control plan, and we're going to need to deal with Clean Water Act issues in this context. We're going to need to address species regulation conflicts between the sort of habitat conservation planning philosophy and the species by species take principle. We need to develop a levee policy ahead of time, both in terms of what kind of mitigation for flooded islands and also for neighboring islands, what kind of pre-flooding policy we have, and where the state wants to go with that, and then coordination with the Army Corps. And then we need to develop the governance and finance rules for a canal, and that's going to have to happen in order for any kind of canal to go forward. So it's really some of the front end stuff that needs to be done. And part of that, in order to go further with that little scheme of what the conveyance capacity might be like, I said there would have to be minimum environmental flows. So a question that has to be answered soon as part of that is what that would look like. I'm happy to say that these guys are starting to look at that question. It's a hard question to answer, but it's something where you have to really combine ecological analysis with hydrodynamics and try to get some sense. And it's not going to be a single number kind of answer. It's really much more about thinking in terms of variability across space, across time, and across seasons, across years. So, but it's an important question to turn to next, I think. And that's my last slide. So, questions?
So, I have a question. Yesterday we were talking with Dave Mraz, and I realized that the subventions program, which has been going for some years now, has effectively made the state a partner in all of those private levees. So aren't they already bound? I mean, this is the old notion of the Pottery Barn. You broke it, you bought it.
Right, and that's there are legal issues on liability that haven't been really resolved yet. So the Jones Tract failure, I mean, that's a case that's pending. You're going to have some folks who are going to argue that it's of state interest. Anyway, so the state owns it. But my sense is that you'd probably be, and I'm not a lawyer, although I play one sometimes, that providing $7 million of funds a year for 1,100 miles of levees is probably not, doesn't mean that you bought it. That would be my feeling.
Ellen, if you're talking about funding the entire solution with water guys, you could do that. That's true. But how do I go say to them, well, we know there are other problems. There are dischargers that put lots of toxics into the delta, and there are other stressors that are very significant, probably as significant as you are. You should pay the full cost to recover the species and take care of that, and don't worry about all those other guys. How does, I mean, maybe on paper they could do it, but politically, how do you actually make that happen?
Well, you can imagine there's not one magic number for ecosystem restoration either, right?
Right.
So, I mean, certainly the assumption of the BDCP has been that they're going to develop a habitat conservation plan that is going to be geared toward recovery, and that's irrespective of. I mean, that's as a project, or as projects, it's not.
I think they are, but if we assume that, say, you need 100,000 acres of land that's restored to tidal and other kinds of habitat in the delta, do I tell the contractors you need to pay for and manage and maintain all 100,000 acres, or do we say, well, we know that this is what we need to do in order to make this restoration. We're going to do our best estimate about what your share of paying should be, and then we need to figure out how we're going to come up with the funding for the rest of it. So,
right.
Which is what I assume we're headed for.
Right. Right, and then there are other regulations that can be used if the state wants to address other stressors, right? If we have the courage to do that. I mean, if we have the courage to do something like this, we ought to not be shy about some of those things.
If one miracle can occur, maybe two can.
Good.
I still don't see. Has the state board ever tackled as large an area? I mean, as you were referring to being essentially a water plan, which would be the entire Sacramento-San Joaquin Valley, and including not just water quality control, but actually amounts. I mean, you specify.
If you're addressing upstream diversions too, they certainly have the authority to have the one question mark in that is probably on groundwater, but in terms of and the authority is greater over post 1914 water rights, but all water under the California Constitution has to meet certain standards, and there have been legal cases that have imposed the requirement to protect the environment for older water too. So, for older water rights. So they could do it from a legal perspective. Do they have the capacity now, or the feeling that they have the political will and support to do that at this point? Probably not. And that's where. But people will also say to you, if you're under the gun, and as happened with the Bay Delta Accords, that you can get stuff done quickly if you need to. So that's an issue for that. Jay mentioned state leadership is really going to be key on a Delta solution, and part of that is giving the state board the ability and mandate to do that.
I got one last question. I really will shut up after that. So, no, I won't. Can you point to an NCCP, HCP plan which actually accommodates climate change? Actually incorporates it in their planning and thinking?
I can't, but what I can say is that the law. All right, so part of the reason we have these regulatory issues is that neither the Clean Water Act nor the Endangered Species Act was forward-looking in terms of thinking about in the early 70s. People didn't really have climate change on the radar, right? So, but the law is evolving in terms of the way both the Interior's decisions on endangered species. So the polar bear decision is a climate change related decision. So basically saying you have to you have to think about climate change in terms of species actions. Judge Wanger's decision on salmon also talked about, basically said that they had to go back to the drawing board and consider climate change. So what hasn't happened is the other side of it, of saying, okay, given climate change and the inevitability of something happening to critter X, we'll also give you a break on that, right? So the law is going in the direction of making you take it into account. And I think the science on this is really just kind of getting the point and really starting to look at what that means. So.
I just wanted to, you mentioned again just now the point that Jay had on his slide about, I think the point is the words were state authority, the way you put it was state leadership. Yet you have identified, and I heartily agree, yet you have identified at least 3 very federal issues there on that last slide and throughout the presentation relative to the Clean Water Act, the Endangered Species Act, and not statutory, but Corps of Engineers levy policy. So how do we broker those issues?
California has been a very important player in influencing federal environmental law all along. Our Clean Water Act passed before theirs. I think our Clean Air Act did too. So for our Clean Air Act, we actually have ability to do some things that other states don't because of that. So I guess my sense is that California is really kind of facing these issues in an important way, and it's an opportunity for us to take some leadership again in working with the feds on this.
So you're optimistic that if the solution can be developed, then the feds will see the.
You know what? I'll tell you
we're
what.
more optimistic now than we were in July.
I'm sorry.
Right.
We're more optimistic now than we were in July.
Yeah.
Well, no, and the other is, the alternative on species is that we're going to be having more and more cases of what's called the God Squad. We're seeking explicit exemptions to the regulation entirely because this is going to be an issue that's happening, and I don't mean just in the Delta, but just more broadly, and so at a certain point that's going to force a need to rethink how we want to provide protection while taking into account changing conditions. So I guess I just feel like it makes sense to try to be proactive about that rather than that's not an ideal solution, I don't think. Thank you.
Yeah, why don't we take a 10-minute break and we'll come back and we'll have a discussion with the panel to finish up our 2-day workshop.